get me started on Brexit. The psychologists tell me if I leave this image up for 45 seconds, 20% of you will buy this book. So, sorry? Oh my God. There's supposed to be a book up there. Is there a book? There it is, thank you. Can we stick with my images, not images of me? That'd be great. So what I want to try and do in this next 15 minutes is to try and summarize some of the key arguments in this book. And I think the best place for me to start is really where Ryan, I think, came to, the place where he really said, we're in this together. We need to act. We're in this together. We are in this together. And flowing from that, and being an urban planner, my motto, if you like, is that planning is managing our coexistence in shared space. What a fabulous way to think of urban planning. Two very powerful concepts, coexistence and shared space. Coexistence and shared space. Our political leaders, especially one of them, could do to understand the imperative of coexistence and shared space. These shared spaces, who gets to design them? Who's in these spaces? People look very different and are increasingly looking different in these shared spaces. How do we develop neighborhood strategies? How do we develop sustainability when people have different ideas of what is sustainable and what is sharing? So through my talk, I'm really going to try and give you 3 or 4 examples of this idea of coexistence and this idea of shared space. And what I want to do is, I'm not trying to demolish the idea of the sharing economy, but I want to move your thinking on to the sharing city, or the sharing paradigm, the paradigm of sharing in cities. And you have an example here of these 2 discourses. They couldn't be more different. And again, I'm not saying the sharing economy is wrong. We may well need market solutions, and we do need market solutions in many ways. But I want to see a stronger imprint of local governments in regulating and nurturing, thank you, and nurturing the sharing economy. Because left alone, we can see what Airbnb does. And you have now very progressive cities like Amsterdam, Reykjavik, Berlin, and a growing number of cities who are saying, this is a great idea, but it's got out of hand. And so I think regulation is really important here. And so you can see the sharing paradigm is not just focused on the economic, it's about social, cultural, and political activity. It has a focus on society underpinning the economy, not the other way around. We see people as interdependent and vulnerable. We need an element of humility here. We see people as relational, not transactional. People don't walk around with dollar signs on their heads. And it's about political and behavioral solutions. So my argument, and the argument in our book, is we need to move this towards the right-hand side. It should have been the left, really, shouldn't it? But anyway, move towards the right-hand side of the chart and move towards this notion of a sharing paradigm. And for those of you in things like resilience, I mean, think about, what I was just saying in terms of coexistence and shared space. Resilience is about exactly that. How do we live in this shared space? So I don't think the sharing economy is going to deliver us resilience, but the sharing economy, I think, is a bigger part of the bigger picture of sharing cities. So the ultimate goal of our book is to really look at co-creating the urban commons, which is what a lot of you are doing. You are co-creating this urban commons where approaches are more cultural than commercial. They're more political than economic, and we think of the city as a co-created urban commons. Now, I want to give some examples, and I want to spend most of my talk giving examples. Why is it that Latin American cities are so cool and far ahead of us in doing amazing things with the urban commons? Curitiba, Bogota, Medellin, Belo Horizonte, Porto Alegre. What's going on in Latin American cities that is enabling them to do this amazingly creative work? In Medellin, the philosophy is social urbanism. This is an idea of putting resources into lower income neighborhoods. It's almost like urban acupuncture, little pinpricks of excellence around the urban poor neighborhoods. And the picture there, you can see the most famous artifacts of this, the Parque Biblioteca, the library park up in the favela, which is, I'll just jump on a slide and then you can see this fabulous architecture in a very low-income neighborhood. It's developed a pride in the neighborhood amongst people. It's a tourist destination. You can see there the cable cars. There's amazing public art. There is a whole range of impressive social and economic development that has gone on through this idea of social urbanism. And it's all funded by the revenue from the city-owned utility. So this is all funded by that. The city is also, and Porto Alegre, some of you will know, is the city that founded the idea of participatory budgeting, but Medellin has the largest participatory budget in the world. But it doesn't end there. So the city residents get to vote on different projects they want funded, but then they have a participatory planning process which says how the projects will be implemented. That goes further than a lot of other participatory budgeting projects that I know of. So Medellin, recreating the urban commons. And remember, those of you who are old enough, this was the city in the 1980s that was drug-riddled. How do you turn a city around like that? Well, I'll tell you one thing, you have visionary mayors. And all of those Latin American cities that I mentioned had visionary mayors. Visionary mayors, not reformers, but transformers. These are transformative mayors. That's a really good tweet there, by the way, at Julian Agyeman. Hashtag just sustainabilities, hashtag sharing cities. Okay? You got it? Good. 2 streets, 2 different countries. Near where I live in Massachusetts Avenue in Cambridge and Södervägen in Gothenburg, there's 2 coffee shops on either side of each street, and I've sat in them and I've watched streets. I've watched these streets. They couldn't be organized differently. The street on the right, there is a right to the street, a right to public space in American streets, and it is predicated on what? The size of your vehicle. The bigger your vehicle, the more rights you have on that street. And on the left, the Swedes have imposed spatial justice on the street. That street has been democratized. It is spatially just. The streets are identical in their width. But on the street on the left, on Södervägen, you can see to the left of the streetcar there is a fence. That 10% of the street is the only part of the street that is open to private vehicles. All the rest, 90% of the streetscape, is more democratic. On the right, you can see, you take your chances in a street like that. Question, the kid growing up on Södervägen or Massachusetts Avenue, kid going out to school every single day, and on the right, they see bigger is better, and on the left, they see order, they see human scale. How does the kid get wired? What's the wiring of the kid like as a result of living on those 2 streets? I don't know. This is a question for a great PhD project. What is the effect of this? Now, we know for definite, we've seen research that has shown that that the more traffic and the higher the velocity of the traffic, the less interaction there is on the street. We can only assume, and it's unfortunate that there's virtually nobody on the street on the left, but we can assume that there is more of a convivium, more of a convivial space for interaction on that street. Another piece of my work around sharing is the idea of sharing an idea, sharing food spaces, sharing an idea. 3 pictures there, and I'm going to challenge you to think very differently. On the bottom right, George and Julia Bowling, tobacco farmers in Maryland, or they were. The state of Maryland now gives grants to help you diversify out of tobacco for every reason. So George and Julia, being good American entrepreneurs, did their research and they found there's 140,000 African immigrants in the DC area, most of them middle class, upper middle class, professors, doctors, etc. They want to eat African food, but they don't want it flown in from Africa, they want it grown locally. You see where I'm going with this? So the sign that says African produce is now the sign to the Bowling farm in Maryland. And a lot of Africans are coming out to buy food from the bowlings and are also helping them find out what will grow. Now, in the middle, I put this very dominant construction of the local foods movement, redolent of an America past. What is local in a multicultural society? What is local food in a multicultural society? The Africans in DC want to eat African food. The Filipinos in San Diego want to eat their own food. Immigrant groups bring with them an imaginary of what their life can be in this new country. Who are we to say what local food is? So what's evolving now in sort of geographical research is this notion of translocalism, that people bring with them their own local. And one thing that the alternative food movement, which as we know is not the most representative movement in the world, one thing the alternative food movement has got to do is to be more reflexive about what is local. And if it wants to build a bigger movement, then they have to understand people will interpret local differently. And if you're an immigrant, you bring your local with you. My final example is what I'm calling laissez-faire food sharing in Boston's community food economy. Government policy drove and is driving a really big network expansion of community food in Boston. It happened this way. Article 89 was a rezoning in Boston for commercial agriculture. That allowed Dudley Land Trust, the community land trust, to get involved with some city-owned parcels. Those parcels are now rented out to city growers, Grow or Die Gardens, the food project. They produce food that is then intermediated, if you like, through Crop Circle Kitchen, which is now Commonwealth Kitchen, and City Fresh Foods. These distribute the food to upper-end restaurants, the local foods movement, into upper echelon restaurants, but also to lower-income neighborhoods. Haley House and Dorchester Food Co-op are food economy incubator businesses. And then Zero is an organization that does composting, and it puts the compost back into these farms. So there's a circular food economy growing here. There's also a really important point here. All of these organizations are working for social justice and equity. They are not primarily economic organizations, although they've got to make a profit. But the jobs are good jobs. There's about 200 people, my colleagues and I estimate, involved in these organizations as direct employees, and it's growing. So it's laissez-faire in that nobody said this should happen, but it's happening. And it's happening because of this spirit of sharing. It's happening in the lowest income neighborhoods, Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan in Boston. This is what we can do when government, when the private sector, when land trusts, when all of these great organizations come together. The question for me, though, now is, should we be guiding this? Does this need to be guided, or does it need to be, in some way, left alone to just develop? So one of the key points we make in our book is really that city leaders need to support a different kind of sharing, more communal, more cooperative. We need to build solidarity and trust. And I think this was something, again, that Ryan was mentioning. In other words, sharing systems must be developed and designed around equity and justice. I'm going to leave you with a thought. How many bike share schemes do you know that are built around equity and justice? I keep getting asked by bike share schemes, they say, hey, we're tremendously successful, but no low-income people or minorities are using our bikes. And I'm thinking, well, on what basis are you saying you're successful? What they mean is they're making money. What would a bike share scheme look like if it were designed around equity and justice? Because at the moment, what I see in bike share schemes is commuting and tourism. So what would an equitable and just bike share scheme look like? And I'll leave you with that point, but just the final point, sharing is really what makes cities work. Cities have a lot of regulatory powers. They can start to use them. They are beginning to use them in terms of Uber and Airbnb, but that is reflexive, that is reactive. Let's move cities into a proactive stance such that they are growing the sharing economy rather than just being on the back foot all the time and being outsmarted often by the likes of Airbnb and Uber. Thank you.